Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of Archive VFX. Today's episode is going to be a retrospective on Pixar's Renderman and the Renderman compliant renderers. I recently completed a video that shows a plugin called MayaMan to convert geometry into usable data that can be sent to a Renderman compliant engine. And I discussed that, but I wanted to start from the beginning and we'll discuss like Renderman and its history and why there are many different Renderman compliant renderers, and then there's the official Pixar Renderman setups. And today I will show you here, we have this Renderman user profile here on this O2. The first time I encountered Renderman, it was almost exactly this experience, except for it was on a PC. It wasn't on an Irix workstation. And the experience was motivated by the fact that there was a website in the late 90s and it was like try Renderman for free. And I was excited because I knew the Pixar Renderman was expensive for a license. And so I couldn't, the fact that you could try it for free was like a pretty exciting prospect for me. And what you did was you downloaded a package of, it was like a zip file, and it had a bunch of little files inside of it. And it was like, now what do I do with this? And I got this, and then it came with a little text file like this to say, here, try it out. And it has this little render command, and you're like, okay, what am I supposed to do with all this? Because it wasn't like an application, like a 3D application, like I had used, there was Lightwave, there was 3D Max, there was Softimage, and there was Power Animator, the alias packages, and then later became Maya. And each one of them had like their own native renderers. But the thing that everybody spoke about was Pixar's Renderman, because Renderman was known for rendering Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park, and of course the Toy Story and all the Pixar animation movies later. And so this is like a famous render engine and technology, but it was like a niche thing that was like proprietary for a while. And then here on the internet, they're like, hey, you want to play with Renderman? And I'll show you how that experience went. The experience was basically like, you get this, download this file off the internet. And I had this pack of folders and I had no idea what to do. And I'm opening up the text file. Experience went pretty much like this. We're going to go in here. You switch over to the directory. And then you would launch it here. You would go, and then I would do like launch this server. And then that would be like a license server. And then you could go into the example. Once it's running, we would go down here and go to the example folder. So we go here, and then what do we have? We have like, oh, there's some files here that we could try to render, and then it gives you this description on, well, here's how you launch the render. So we're going to pick the ball test, and it's got these like options, and it tells you like here's what the options do. If you have like zero sky, one is water, wavy polka dots, you can like mix and match the things. And like, let's take a look here. We'll just do a basic ball test and launch it here, and bam, oh wow, there you go. Renderman's rendering a sphere with a sky and a star. And it was like, okay, this is neat. I'm actually utilizing here some kind of rendering technology. And we'll do some other options here, and it's like, oh, we've got this like water background, and here's the ball with the star. It feels very Pixar-y, having that sphere with the star on it, like the lamp, with the Luxo Junior lamp and the little ball here. And so it's like, okay, this is cool. This is Renderman, but it's also is like a little bit of a long sigh. Like, okay, it's neat. I'm able to render Renderman, but how do I use this? What do I do with this? How do I get this to work with what I know, which is to open up a 3D like Lightwave or Maya or Softimage or 3D Max? How can we get something where how to model the stuff and you can set lights where you want? Because this is a very difficult thing. And there were books back in the day that I remember purchasing a book, and it was like Learning Renderman, and it was like you're entering all this data like numbers that define where the verts are on a cube, and then it's like, hey, now you can draw a normal with that. And it's like a very, very probably programmer specific topic where where people who want to learn how to program 3D software and viewports and things like this like that was their arena, and I was just an end user, which was like I was more interested in. I already wanted to have an application in place to render this stuff, and so that's where the translators come in. And so in the last video that I made about which says MayaMan to Renderman, that is one of those translators, and so we'll get into that now. Okay, we've jumped over to the Octane for this demo, and so this first part is just going to be how to shut down the Entropy server and restart the basic PRman server. So you should skip ahead, and there should be a chapters at the bottom on the timeline that mark this section with licensing, and then you can skip ahead to the next part if this isn't something that interests you, if you're not a person with an SGI machine trying to make this happen. So for this part, for those that are still here, we have to work out the fact that I run the Xlunad licensing server, so I can run Entropy through MayaMan. Okay, so we need to use that LM down to shut it down. So let's see if we go //lm down -c.license.dat. And now it's saying, do I want to shut this down? And yes, we do. So now we're letting that go down. Render what should be, let's see, user.local. And there's our PRman. So let's go into there. There's a couple of installs, but it'll jump to this latest one here. So if we go PRman, and we need the same thing, same folder like we find in the other one. They have their own little plugins, a lot of little stuff going on here. So they got a little target, little image file formats, and the same thing. They have this information here for the starting the server sub folder. And we should still have, yeah. So then we are going to do lm grd space c space license .dat. And there we go. So now we are running the Pixar. It's instead of the Xluna D, we got the Pixar D. With the official Pixar running, now we're going to also build like we did before. So we're going to start MayaMan like we did on the other video, which is in my downloads folder. This should be a local user setup, but I still have it here in a messy little layout. Clear all that out. Get this guy selected, change the directory. There we go. And then the same thing as we did before. We're trying to source an environment so that these environment variables in here get set up so that it will run MayaMan. And we just do source mayaman.env. It configures it, and then the last step is to then run Maya, which the version that I have for this one is version 4, because the MayaMan I have runs in 4 and 4.5. And so yeah, we need this information here. So change directory user, intended to. So let's do Maya. And let's play with the Pixar Renderman. Okay, first thing before we do any geometry is we'll just get into setting up the MayaMan globals. And the default, usually I'll have to switch over to Entropy or the Blue Moon rendering tools. But in the MayaMan's default setup is to point at 3.8 or 3.9 Pixar Renderman. So that's working, and we go down here to the MayaMan paths, look for environment variables, and this is the one that we also have to point it to the correct PRman tree. And so this will be like I did before. It should be user local, enter, and then yeah, we'll just point it at this PRman here and say that's the one we want to use. And so we'll apply all changes, and so now we're in that, and now we can start playing with Renderman. And so I'm going to time lapse this here and just get us a basic thing going. Okay, we get a little spotlight in here, just something to aim at it. Let's do a little lighting. We'll set the lighting to use all the lights so we can kind of see what our spotlight's doing. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some geometry here to this plane so we can see what's happening to it. There we go. Yeah, you can kind of see what the spotlight's doing per polygon there. And let's go into our attributes and we'll make the polygon wider. We'll make the spotlight wider. We'll make the penumbra a little soft. And we'll start there. So without any shadows or anything. So let's just test out Pixar's Renderman right away. And you'll see that it is pretty effective. It draws pretty fast. So there we go. Just bam, there it goes. So let's go, and MayaMan's going to listen to some of the, it's going to pay attention to your render globals here. And so we got to set the renders higher. I'm going to make this a TIFF file. And I'm gonna go, we'll go like, maybe we'll start it at 720. I'll do this, and then we can go down to like 960 or something like this. Yeah. So let's take a look at that again. Let's preview under single frame. You can see here, Renderman is like flying through this. We're using Pixar's PRman 3.9. You know, we can't rely on pure ray tracing to get reflections and shadows. And so if we do like, let's see here, if we go linear decay, so we'll make this turn up to, let's close this off here. We're gonna instead, with this older Renderman, we have to rely on maps. So there's shadow maps and reflection mapping and these kind of things. So this was like the early way that you tried to solve these problems, was through maps. And so here's this depth map. We'll just leave this here and try to just run that, see what that looks like. And we have to run this up here a lot brighter. So we'll go like 25, yeah. And we have this little depth map with 512 here, and we'll see how that looks. Render single frame. And sure enough, so now we're getting this. Now if I switch that over to ray tracing, I don't think it'll work. I think if we say, okay, let's shut this off, and we go use ray tracing, even if I use a few rays here, I don't think it's going to respect it because there wasn't a way to ray trace in this early of the engine here. So yeah, you see it's not seeing it. And so this is, with this first version of, you know, Pixar's Renderman, you have to do tricks with like maps. And so let's get into that. And so let's start testing this out. So we'll get out of the ray trace, we'll go to depth map, and we want to get into maybe with the depth map here, we have this you know, the resolution of the shadow map. And so let's see, let's try to do like a more accurate, like 1024. And then when we render it, it won't be quite as shredded up around the edges here. It'll be like a little bit smoother. Yeah, I see it's like the resolution's higher and it's making the edge a lot more crisp here. Okay, and now there are plugins that come with MayaMan that can create certain attributes. And so let's here, we have this light here, and we're going to add a light attribute to it. And you see this MayaMan light attribute here, and we'll see what they have. These got these depth map shadow attributes and ray trace shadow attributes. And let's see here, they have soft shadows. And so this is a neat feature. So this is like before area lights, there was a way to create soft shadows. And so we're going to try to enable this. And it's an interesting thing to create soft shadows here. So because we're creating a map that averages over multiple lights. So if I try to like click this guy here, you see this random spotlight shows up. And it's basically like the same. It's like it's cloned the initial spotlight, and then it's going to create, like from here, these two are going to interact and create like a soft shadow. But the trick is that it kind of randomly places it. And so we don't want that. We want to be closer. And then I would like snap it to this light here. I'll show you how I did that. So with that selected, and I'm using the local. If you want to switch to the world, you can double click the move tool here and it'll bring up this option. You'll see here's like world space selection and object selection. In later Mayas, you could switch this by holding down the W and left click, and you could actually switch using that. And in this early version of Maya, you can't quite do that. So then I'm going to use the V key. If you see the V key, turns that little square right here into a circle. I can middle mouse drag this guy and it'll snap to points, like snap to vertices. everything like that, and then it'll snap to this light, and I'm just use the X key to just bring it over a little bit. And then that is how I achieve that, to get that in the same space, but I didn't change everything. So before we move on with this soft shadow, I'm going to delete that guy again. And we want to change the bias here because this is a little bit too tight. So this will create a lot of like weird noise. So I'm going to change the gap bias here to 0.2 on the first light. And we want to do this to the first light because as we create the other lights, it's going to duplicate the attributes here. And we want to go to the spotlight shape, and then this DMAP resolution here, we also want to do the DMAP bias to 0.2, make it a lot more soft as they overlap each other. So now we'll go back to these light attributes, hit this guy again, and there it is. And I'm just going to grab that guy and hold V down and hold middle mouse down, and then it'll snap. And then we'll move this guy just over so it's at the edge, and we're just going to do this a couple of times here. And so there we go. So we have these 4 lights, and it's going to have to calculate the maps for each one as we go. Now let's see here. I'll save this scene as PRman basic 001. And let's check this out here. So we go MayaMan, render single frame. We'll see how soft our shadows are. See, now it's making the map. So this is unlike ray tracing. We're doing some old school Renderman tricks here by generating these maps that will become the soft shadow maps. So now it's slowing down the renderer a little bit. Yeah, see, it's about the same brightness. But now we're getting a nice soft shadow, and this is what we want here. We want to get a little bit more of a realistic shadow, which is really what it really makes a difference in the quality of your render, is if you have an actual shadow that feels physically correct. And so here we go. Now we're using Renderman, and even though we don't have ray tracing, we're cheating it by doing these tricks that you used to have to do in the mid to late 90s in order to get some of this stuff to look nice. And so here's like a nice soft shadow map here. We can separate those up a little bit more to soften it up here. Okay, it looks pretty good. Yeah, we got it's really soft on the edge here, and yet still going sharp to the contact point. This looks really good here. And it renders pretty quickly. I mean, this is like if you did an area light to try to draw this out, I don't think it would draw it as fast. So this is pretty neat how the Pixar's Renderman was really optimized for speed and still getting a high quality image. Okay, so the next thing, what do we need? We want to start coloring these things up with shaders, but we'll find quickly that we can't reflect, and we'll have to get a reflection map here. So we have to find a way to get reflections because we can't just turn on the shader and get reflections out of it. So I'm going to apply a material here. We'll assign a Fong E to this, and we'll call this the usual. And what I'm going to do, you guys have seen this setup before. So I'm going to set this up, and then I'll time lapse to the end here. Coming out of time lapse here, have a nice little scene here that we can reflect, and so this looks pretty good. But yeah, if we look at what we've done here, we have this Fong material, this green sphere, and it has reflectivity and everything, with some information, but is it going to reflect? Okay, we have a pretty neat image here. And we have a specular hit, but yeah, we're not getting any reflection, even though these stats are turned on. There's no ray tracing. We can try to go in here and tell it to ray trace, but this isn't going to turn that on. This isn't going to make that work. So here we go. See, we've tested with all the ray tracing turned on, and we're still not seeing anything. So how do we go about this? And this is how these interpreter plugins work with Renderman, is that they have their own internal features. And so let's see what we have. We utilized a light attribute here, and then there's material attributes and model attributes. And so let's go into shader itself here. So we have this little green shader. We'll go into Hypershade. Take a look at this shader here. We'll graph the network, and we've got a green sphere made with a Phong. And we need some attributes. So I'm going to select this material, and we'll go MayaMan, and we'll add a material attribute. Now if I go up and down chain here, we should see this MayaMan attribute, and they should appear here in this list too. And you can see reflections. And so here's how we're reaching in. We're taking a third-party user interface, and we're saying we want to reach into Pixar's Renderman and utilize one of the features that isn't quite available just by turning something on at the material level. And so we're saying, hey, we want the reflections to be cube face is kind of like a almost like a spherical thing, but it's done on a cube, like a world reflection map. And so it's going to fire rays and make basically a reflection map that applies, that will, you know, be seen by the faces here. And so we'll give it 8 reflection samples. And let's see, what does it do? We've got reflectivity. I'm going to probably turn this down to like 250 here. We don't need it that hot. And now that has that, if we go back to this sphere here, you see we've got a few things. And on the green sphere, we would have the MayaMan attributes here that tell it what's going on here. So let's take a look at that and see what we get from it. Okay, now you're seeing that here in the render, we have this nice reflection happening, and we can probably play with that a little bit more. I'm going to tweak it. I'm going to create a little reflector light, and then we'll move on from there and tweak this final render. I'm going to also add a ambient light and just set this to basically the intensity to 0.220. And that'll bring up this dark black. It'll give us a little bit here, almost like there's a little bit of GI mixed in there. And then I'll create a reflector card and we'll give it another render. Okay, here we go. We have this reflector card here, but I haven't turned off the specular hit, which is a non-reflective process that happens on these splin and Phong shaders, and that reflector card would be in the middle of there, but I left the specular on. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw a couple of geometries in there. I'm going to duplicate this green into a red and blue geometry on 2 other, like a torus and a cylinder, and I'll do the same thing where I have the reflection map added to the material and made into a blue shader. We'll go over here, and red shader will go over here for the final image, and then we'll move on to the next section of covering Renderman. Okay, so here's our final image where we have, you know, 3 items in geometry, and they have reflection mapping on all of them. And we have the soft shadows set up on the light up here, and a nice little environment for it to reflect so we can see the reflections. And I have those, like the ambient light is filling in these in the dark shadows so that it appears there's bounced light in here, because we don't have the global illumination turned on. I'm not sure if we can use GI in this early version of PRman. I don't know if they had an environment light that you could invoke and bounce some color bleed into this or not. But here's an initial great render for such an old version of Renderman. The way early Renderman usage was often proprietary software, and so there are a lot of usage cases where you would find products out there in the you know, early 90s or late 90s and early 2000s that were interpreters. And so Pixar had their own Renderman artist tools, and those would do alias to Renderman. So they had Power Animator converting its scene files into the Renderman renderer, and then later Maya to Renderman, which is MTOR plugins that came with the Renderman artist tools, and then they were releasing Renderman Studio. And then you had third-party vendors like Animal Logic that had offices in, I know they had an office in Venice on Abbot-Kinney, although I don't know if they made the plugins there. And Animal Logic was working on the Matrix films, and they had this thing, which was like MayaMan, and they also have another one called Softman, and I even think they made one for 3D Studio Max. Here, I'm going to show the images that I can find on the web here. There was a whole wave of third-party solutions for getting stuff from the more popular 3D animation applications like Maya, Softimage, Max. Even there was a company called Moss Digital, which was Daniel Moss, and he did a animation of the Mars rover, and it looked fantastic at the time. And I remember, like, how did he render that? And it was done with Renderman. He wrote his own in between, like he actually created his own software compiler to take the stuff out of Lightwave and then run it to Renderman. And I think that was his own proprietary software, because I emailed him a few times like, hey, can I get this? I want to be able to render out of Lightwave into Renderman. And so there's this whole suite of plugins out there that existed in order to just get something from an application into Renderman. And then there were, Renderman compliant renderers, which is what I covered in the last video, which was Entropy. There's Blue Moon rendering tools, all these ones here that are in these globals here. These are some of the more, larger ones, which is the render.c, there's Air, there's Entropy, Blue Moon rendering tools, and of course the Pixar stuff. If you weren't using the official Pixar Renderman artist tools or Renderman Studio. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go over some other versions of Renderman that appear in other versions of Maya. There's this Renderman artist tools, which I could not get working in Irix. We had a few versions that we could not get working inside the Irix Mayas that were available. And so I'll show off a few of the other Rendermans as they progressed along here.